What's going on, everybody? Welcome into an all-new episode of the Pack a Day Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. Training camp, of course, is just around the corner. And what would the start of training camp be without a pre-training camp 53-man roster prediction? But today is so much more than just a pre-training camp 53-man roster prediction. It is a 70-man roster prediction because, as I will tell you every single year, with the addition of practice squad call-ups and just how many injuries there are throughout the year and how many players come from your actual practice squad to make those call-ups and to make the roster throughout the course of the season, this truly is a 70-man roster. So we will go through the 53-man roster, we will go through the 17-man practice squad, and then we will go through everyone that was released as well. So we're going to go through all of it today. But let's start with the 53 first, and we're going to start, of course, at quarterback. Jordan Love. I'm not going to shock anyone. He's going to make the team as your number one starting quarterback. However, I am going to go with three quarterbacks on this roster: Jordan Love, Sean Clifford, and Michael Pratt. I think with Sean Clifford, you spent a fifth round on him a season ago. I think he showed enough backup quarterback ability with a little bit of upside sprinkled in that, yes, he had a bad end to, what mini camp was it, where he had 4 picks in 2 days. That doesn't exactly leave an amazing taste in your mouth. I think he's going to be just fine. And I think coming back in year 2, knowing more of this offense, I think that's going to be a somewhat valuable asset for Green Bay to continue to hold on to and continue to try to develop. Second year with Tom Clements, I think he still makes the roster, and I think he actually is the backup quarterback coming out of camp in preseason. But I think Michael Pratt will show enough where Green Bay will not want to subject him to waivers. And it's quite possible that Pratt may not win that number 2 job, but again, is good enough and shows enough in preseason that they think that if they were to release him, some other team would pick him up off of waivers. And you always have to be cognizant of and remember that there will be teams towards the bottom of the league, like Carolina, for example, and amongst others, who aren't necessarily fighting for a big-time playoff spot or a Super Bowl run this season. Doesn't mean that they're not trying to win, but it means a lot of times they have more flexibility at the bottom of their roster. It might be harder for a team like Green Bay to hold on to 3 quarterbacks on their 53 when they're trying to compete right now. But if they subject him to waivers, Carolina might say, hey, he showed some stuff in preseason. Maybe we liked him coming out of the draft, but we just didn't have the ability to take him. Now we can pick him up off of waivers, and Green Bay just loses him completely for no compensation. And I don't think they're going to want to go in that direction. If it comes down to it, could they release Sean Clifford if they like Michael Pratt enough? Yeah, I think that's possible. Do I think it's super likely? No. I do wonder what their appetite will be for keeping 3 quarterbacks. If they do feel like, hey, we're only going to keep 2, may the best man win. If it's Pratt, it's Pratt. If it's Clifford, it's Clifford. But we're not going to go in that direction of keeping 3 guys on the roster. That does make things a little bit tight. It makes it tough. When you're talking about a 3rd quarterback on the roster, you're talking about 1 less guy for special teams on the active game day rosters. I know you can only activate 48 guys anyway, but I do wonder, that just doesn't help you with special teams towards the back of the roster in any capacity. And for somebody like Michael Pratt, it's basically a true red shirt, assuming, again, Clifford makes the team, or if Clifford is the number 3, then still you're basically redshirting him. You're hoping that it doesn't get to the case where you actually need 3 quarterbacks through the course of this season. So it's basically you're just keeping upside here. But I think Pratt has enough of it. I already saw some flashes at OTAs and minicamps and rookie minicamp that were impressive enough that I would not want to maybe subject him to waivers if I didn't have to. I think it's a very reasonable, sort of conclusion to jump to that you would want to keep him on the team. And I do think Green Bay ultimately keeps 3 quarterbacks. Running back, same number. We're going with 3 here as well. Josh Jacobs and Marshawn Lloyd are complete 100% lead pipe locks. A.J. Dillon, I'm going to go with him as number 3 as well. I've already talked through on numerous occasions how Emmanuel Wilson or a Jarvion Howard or someone like that could get their name in the conversation here. They're going to have to get close enough to Dillon to make it competitive. And then you start getting into those roster conversations about how much they make, age, team control, etc. But A.J. Dillon brings enough to the table here where I do think he gets that third and final running back spot. He's a good enough pass protector. He's a good enough runner between the tackles, can catch the ball to the backfield. And I do think he's going to be ultra motivated now, knowing he didn't get that big contract in his first free agent season. And now, if he does have a really nice year this year, he'll have an opportunity to get paid next year in unrestricted free agency again, because it is just a one-year deal for Dillon. Could somebody like an Emmanuel Wilson or a Jarvion Howard make it as a number 4 running back? Sure. But then it's going to cost you somewhere else. And maybe that it costs you at that quarterback position. If you're going to keep 3 quarterbacks, if you're going to keep 6 wide receivers, which we'll talk about in just a moment, if you're going to keep some depth at some other positions, that makes it harder to put an extra player at a spot like running back. And for running backs, I don't think Green Bay needs to do that unless they feel amazing about Emmanuel Wilson and they don't want to let go of A.J. Dillon. And I think we all get attached to these players and think, oh, they're just going to get claimed by other teams. If Emmanuel Wilson goes out and has a really good preseason, then you're going to have a conversation. But then again, that's where you get in that conversation of, do you want to keep Wilson or Dillon? And then it maybe becomes close. But if Wilson looks fine, good, whatever, and you still want to keep him around, but maybe he didn't blow the roof off of things, you probably just release him and get him back on the practice squad. And I don't think you sweat it out too much. And if some team does pick him up, all right, that's a bummer, but you can probably find another Emmanuel Wilson-esque running back somewhere on waivers or just a practice squad somewhere if you ever need to pick him up through the course of the season, and you probably don't lose too much sleep over it. So would I like to see Wilson still try to make the team? Do I think there's still upside there? I do. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he's just off the roster by any means. I do think there's an avenue there. But when I put this roster together, how I kind of go about doing this is I don't count to 53 as I'm going through it. I put together who I think is going to make the 53-man roster, and then who's going to be on the practice squad and who gets cut. And then I see where the numbers are. And it was unbelievable how smooth this exercise went. When I finished it up, again, I didn't count through or say, how many I could keep at any position or things like that. I had 54 that I had on the active roster. I had 16 on the practice squad, and everyone else was released. So the only thing I had to do when I got to the end of it was move one player from the active roster to the practice squad. That was the only thing I had to do. Everything else lined up perfectly. And I think in this case, keeping 3 running backs is probably the more logical way to go. And you hope and cross your fingers you can get Wilson back on the practice squad. Wide receiver, I'm going the obvious 6. Could Samori Toure or Grant Dubose or maybe one of the undrafted guys get their name in the conversation here? Maybe, but we'll say it one more time. If you want to keep an extra guy here, which would be keeping 7 wide receivers, again, 3 quarterbacks or one of these other positions are going to have to take a hit because you want an extra player at a position that is going to cost you somewhere else. And in this case, it would take a Grant Dubose or a Samori Toure, someone like that, having a really big offseason to get to the point where you would want to keep 7 wideouts. And I think you just have a really well-rounded, good enough group of 6 that unless that happens, again, you just probably try to move on and try to get as many of those guys back on the practice squad as you possibly can. So Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Bo Melton, and Malik Heath all make the team. No 7th wide receiver. 5 of those are basically locks, in my opinion: Watson, Doubs, Reed, Wicks, and Melton. And I think Heath is very, very likely to make the team. I think it's just a very clear and obvious 6. I don't think you need much more than that. I think you have all different flavors of wide receiver here. I think it works out really well. And you see what happens to guys that don't make it, and if you can get them back on the practice squad. I'm going 3 tight ends. Tyler Davis is the interesting one here, especially with his special teams prowess. But I think they go without Tyler Davis. I think they try to get him back on the practice squad, knowing that they can call him up if they would need him for a game, specifically from a special team standpoint. But I think you just go with your trio of young, talented second-year tight ends: Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft, and Ben Sims. Tyler Davis does not make it, nor do any of the other tight ends on the roster. This just feels right as well. I don't think you really need much more here. Ben Sims showed he was a pretty darn good blocking tight end, and I think he's got more upside as a receiving tight end than what he was able to show a year ago. Tucker Kraft's your all-around tight end. Luke Musgrave's your receiving tight end. It's a good, well-rounded group of young, talented players, and you want to get those three as much playing time as possible, and then hopefully you get Davis back on the practice squad, so if something were to happen, you still have somebody that you can call up. I think Davis is more than capable of being a number 3 tight end, especially with his special teams ability. He gives effort as a blocker. He's an okay wide receiver. That's not the worst number 3 tight end in the world. So they can get him back on the practice squad. I think that would be a win. We'll talk about that practice squad in a moment. But for now, Musgrave, Kraft, and Sims make the initial 53 at tight end. Offensive line was tough. I went only with 9. This is where I had to, when I said I had 54 guys, when I put it all together, I had to go from 10 offensive linemen to 9. I think this does make some sense, though. So I'll go with my 9 first, and then I'll explain my reasoning. Rasheed Walker, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, Sean Ryan, Zach Tom, Jordan Morgan, Jacob Monk, Travis Glover. Those 8 feel like pretty much locks. And then I kept Andre Dillard as the 9th. I wanted to keep Donovan Jennings as well, or maybe just a 10th offensive lineman. Could that be somebody else? Yes. I had Donovan Jennings on my initial. I moved him to the practice squad, again, which we'll go over. The player I feel least confident about on this entire 53-man breakdown is Andre Dillard. I have no idea how to sort of factor him in. He arguably was the worst offensive lineman that played significant snaps in the entire NFL last year. He's a former first-round pick. Green Bay gave him no guaranteed money. They are under no obligation to try to keep him on the roster for financial purposes or anything like that. They can just clearly move on if they want to. Now, he did receive first-team snaps at offensive tackle already in OTA and minicamp. Now, that's in large part due to Zach Tom being out with an injury, but it was still interesting that he got that nod over other players on the roster. Looked okay in OTA and minicamp. Now it's going to be up to him taking some sort of step in training camp and showing that he's better than what he was a season ago. And like I said, all he needs to do is kind of get where he was in, I think it was year 3, where he showed enough to be a solid swing tackle. That's all Green Bay needs from him here. I think there's probably just enough upside. Matt LaFleur was very complimentary of him that he's the one that they keep around. And I think it makes sense from a 48-man roster standpoint. I think you have your potential starters in Walker, Jenkins, Myers, Ryan, and Tom. Jordan Morgan might be your ultimate next guy up off the bench for the offensive line. You've got Jacob Monk, who can play the interior, and then Andre Dillard, who can play at either tackle spot. I think that gives you a pretty well-rounded 8-man, rotation or offensive lineman group for your 48-man roster. So yeah, I think that's probably the way that they go. I don't see any of your rookies in Jacob Monk or Travis Glover going anywhere. Could they keep a 10th? Yeah, absolutely. And quite frankly, I wanted to keep 10, but here's kind of where I came down with everything. Do you need 10 on your actual 53? No. Do I think they can get a lot of those guys back on the practice squad? Yes. And I think they will think enough of Donovan Jennings, Caleb Jones, Luke Tenuta, Kadeem Telfort. I think they'll think enough of those 4 guys where even if they only keep or get 3 of them back on the practice squad, they're going to feel pretty good about their overall depth. And I think there's a chance they can get all 4 of them back. So I think they're going to have enough guys that they're going to release along the offensive line that they're going to be able to get back on their practice squad, that they'll have plenty of depth overall. I think they still, in this case, and when we get to the practice squad, we'll go over it again, but could get 13 offensive linemen on the 70-man, and I think that's plenty. It just so happens that only 9 of them are actually on the 53, but that's where, again, you have to remember there's more than just the 53, and in this case, the 70-man matters a ton, especially when you think you can get a lot of those guys back on your actual practice squad. So again, Walker, Jenkins, Myers, Ryan, Tom, Morgan, Monk, Glover, and Dillard are your 9 offensive linemen. So just to recap the offense really quick, Love, Clifford, and Pratt at quarterback, Jacobs, Lloyd, and Dillon at running back, Watson, Dobbs, Reed, Wicks, Melton, and Heath at wide receiver, Musgrave, Kraft, and Sims at tight end, Walker, Jenkins, Myers, Ryan, Tom, Morgan, Monk, Glover, and Dillard along the offensive line. All right, let's jump over to the defensive side of the ball, starting with the interior defensive line. I think this one also is pretty self-explanatory, pretty simple. It's 5 guys: Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Carl Brooks, and Colby Wooden. And 4 of those are locks in Wyatt, Slayton, Brooks, and Clark. And then you've got Colby Wooden, who I think not only, again, 4th round pick a season ago, clearly they think highly of him, had some flashes from last season that I think are very exciting. And I think he's going to take a step in year 2, put on some functional strength. And then I think the other thing too is that they've started to play him as both a defensive end and a defensive tackle, which is just going to give him more options, more flexibility, and more opportunity to get active on a 48-man roster when you do have the ability to play both of those spots. It's just the more you can do, the more likely you are to get active. And I think that's going to help them both make the team and have the ability to get active when they put their 48-man active rosters together. On the defensive end side, you've got Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Lucas Van Ness, Kingsley Enagbare, and Brenton Cox. I talked to you guys about it coming off of OTA and minicamp. There wasn't anyone that caught my eye from like a year 2 jump sort of thing as much as Brenton Cox. And that's saying something because that is a ridiculous group of second-year players. But we also know Brenton Cox didn't get to show a lot in year 1, so he's got more opportunity to showcase himself in year 2 because we saw so many of those players in their rookie year already put some really, really great stuff on the field. Brenton Cox didn't have that same opportunity. But what he was doing at OTAs and minicamp was ultra impressive. And there were times, and I don't say this to pump up a guy just to tear him down or anything like that. There were times where I had to do a double take because I thought it was Rashawn Gary, and it was actually Brenton Cox, the 52 to the 57, the converting speed to power, the size, like all of it. I'm like, oh, that's Rashawn. No, that's Brenton Cox. And I'm not saying he's going to be Rashawn Gary. I'm not saying that that's going to carry over into training camp. When the pads come on, things change. The offensive linemen are a little bit tougher to move around, but he was super impressive in OTA and minicamp. And I cannot wait to see him at training camp to see if he can carry that over and hopefully bring that over into the preseason as well. He's a fun player to watch, and it was even more fun than I've ever seen him at his most recent practices. So I think he's going to make a name for himself. I really do. I'm not saying as a starting edge or anything like that, but I think enough to make it as a 5th defensive end on this roster. And I'm sure they're going to need as much depth as possible along that defensive line through the course of the season. So again, 5 defensive ends in Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, LVN, Enagbare, and Brenton Cox. At linebacker, keeping 5 here as well. Quay Walker, Edgerrin Cooper, Tyron Hopper, all 3 of those are locks. Isaiah McDuffie, extremely likely. And then I kept Eric Wilson as a core special teamer as well. I really like Eric Wilson as that fit. That's probably the real decision here. He's one of the elder statesmen on the roster, one of the rare players that are right around that age of 30. But he, to me, is not only a core special teamer and a potential special teams captain, but I also think that he is an underrated actual linebacker where he's not one of these, specialists where if they actually get in the game like a Dallin Levitt was, where if he actually gets in the game as a safety, you are in trouble. I actually think Eric Wilson can hold up just fine as a linebacker in this defense, and you're not going to notice him in a significantly bad way. Now, I'm not saying that you want to put him out there, and I'm not saying he's probably not linebacker number 5, but it will be crazy sometimes as how injuries happen and multiple injuries at the same position. And all of a sudden you're down to your 5th linebacker and Eric Wilson has to step in. I think you're going to be fine. I really, really do. So the fact that he's got some veteran experience, the fact that he is a core special teamer and he's a pretty decent linebacker as well, to me keeps him, is an easy keep at that number 5 linebacker spot, certainly over anyone else that is currently on the roster. Corner, we're going to keep 6 here. Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine. All 4 of those pretty much locks, although Stokes a little bit more interesting, but probably all locks to make the team. Corey Ballantyne, based on his contract that he got, I think he's a very, very likely player to make the team as well. They're also putting him in the slot and outside to give him more versatility there. And then I do think Kalen King, we know Goody doesn't like to cut his draft pick, so I think there's a very good chance he makes it as a number 6 corner. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. I do think Robert Rochelle can get in that conversation, or they could go with 5 corners here as well, especially with some of those safeties having some at least slot corner versatility. But I'm going to go with 6 corners: Jair, Stokes, Nixon, Ballantyne, and Kalen King. I do want to see what Kalen King can bring to the table in preseason and camp. Like I said, I don't think he's a lock, especially as a super late 7th round pick in a weaker bottom of a draft like this past draft was. But I think there's going to be enough upside there. He's going to have to show himself on teams. That's why I think Robert Rochelle could get his name in that conversation. Rochelle is in all likelihood going to be a much better special teams player than what Kalen King will be in year one. But if he can show some special teams ability as a rookie, then Kalen King will have a much better chance to make the team. I do think he finds a way to make it on. Safety, I'm going with 5 safeties here as well. Xavier McKinney, Javon Bullard, Kitano Ladapo, Evan Williams, and Anthony Johnson Jr. I think AJJ is the interesting one because I don't think he has quite the special teams ability as a Benny Sapp or a Zane Anderson, but I do think he has more upside as a true pure safety. So those get into interesting discussions of, do you want to keep the upside play or do you want to keep the better special teamer? If they go special teamer, it could be Benny Sapp or Zane Anderson. If they want to keep the better potential long-term safety, I think it could be Anthony Johnson Jr., and that's a decision they're going to have to come to. And I think that could be one of the, bottom of the roster decisions that is much more intriguing than maybe we think it is. We all really liked Anthony Johnson Jr. coming out of college. He struggled last year when he was on the field. He did get the first starting reps at safety opposite Xavier McKinney while these rookies sort of get acclimated. I don't think that's going to stick, and I do think Anthony Johnson will have to sort of fight for his roster life, but I do think he ultimately makes it as the 5th safety. Special teams, I'm going Daniel Whalen, Anders Carlson, and Peter Bowden. I do think Bowden beats out Matt Orzik. I think just a little bit younger, a little bit more developmental upside there, and Orzik just quite frankly was not very good last year. Anders Carlson, I think makes it, I don't want to say by default, but I do think he just has the best upside and has kicked the best so far. Joseph, I don't think beats him out. It's tougher to say with James Turner because we haven't really seen him yet, or at least haven't seen him in green and gold. But for now, I'm going Anders. I still think he's the odds-on favorite to win that kicking spot. And then again, Whalen and Bowden, his other 2 special teamers at punter and long snapper, respectively. So to recap defense and special teams, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Carl Brooks, and Colby Wooden, Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, LVN, Kingsley Nigbari, and Brenton Cox, Quay Walker, Edrin Cooper, Tyron Hopper, Isaiah McDuffie, and Eric Wilson, Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, Corey Ballantyne, and Kalen King, Xavier McKinney, Javon Bullard, Kitano Ladapo, Evan Williams, and Anthony Johnson Jr. at safety, with Whalen, Carlson, and Bowden on special teams. That leaves us a 17-man practice squad of Emmanuel Wilson and Jarvion Howard at running back, Henry Pearson at fullback, Grant Dubose and Julian Hicks at wide receiver, Tyler Davis at tight end, Donovan Jennings, Caleb Jones, Luke Tenuta, and Kadeem Telfort along the offensive line, Jonathan Ford at defensive tackle, Keyshawn Banks and Kenneth Odumegwu as edge rushers, Odumegwu being a international pathway program to get them that extra practice squad spot to bring them up to 17, Christian Welch at linebacker, Robert Rochelle at corner, Zane Anderson, and Benny Sapp at safety. The players who were outright cut, not put on the 53, not put on the practice squad, included Ellis Merriweather, Samori Toure, more on that in a moment, Alex Magoo, Dimitri Stanley, Joel Wilson, Messiah Swinson, Royce Newman, Lasitas Smith, Spencer Waggy, James Esther, Deslin Alexander, Aaron Mosby, Raylan Goforth, Christian Young, Zion Gilbert, Gemmin Green, Tyler Coyle, Greg Joseph, James Turner, and Matt Orzik. As far as Samori Toure goes, I'm sure they would probably like him back on the practice squad. My guess is one of those wide receivers looks for greener pastures elsewhere with all the super young, talented wide receivers on this team already. And I could see Green Bay trying to prioritize Grant Dubose as their practice squad wide receiver. And I could see Samori Toure ending up in another spot just because his opportunities in Green Bay are likely going to be extremely limited. One thing I do want to touch base on here before we head out, what this would amount to if it did go in this direction. And like I said, I think this turns out to be a very well-rounded 53-man roster, but special teams is the really interesting one. In our scenario today, Zane Anderson was cut, Robert Rochelle was cut, Benny Sapp was cut, Tyler Davis was cut, Henry Pearson was cut, Christian Welch was cut. All 7 of those should be, potentially your some of your core special teams guys. In this case, we decided to keep more upside players on the roster and some of these, kind of young 7th round picks like Michael Pratt and Kalen King, who might not be able to do much in year 1, who might not be able to give you anything on team. Certainly Michael Pratt will not. And you are suffering at special teams because of it. I think that's where Green Bay is going to have to make some really interesting decisions of, do they want to prioritize guys like Michael Pratt, Brenton Cox, Kalen King, Anthony Johnson Jr., these young players who have some really big upside potentially and some really impressive talent at their given positions, but aren't going to give you much on teams? Or do they want to stack the bottom of the roster with special teams guys like Zane Anderson, Robert Rochelle, Benny Sapp, Tyler Davis, Christian Welch, Henry Pearson? Those are going to be the very interesting discussions, and those things could definitely shape the bottom of the roster. I went with more upside at the individual positions, but that could definitely hurt the special teams. Hopefully, by keeping this many guys in the practice squad, they're going to be able to call some of those guys up to aid in their special teams journey this season. But those will be some very interesting discussions and decisions that the Packers will have to make through the course of this year, and certainly during cutdown time. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Always appreciate you guys. Shout out to our Hall of Fame and All-Pro members, Mo State of Minnesotan, PJ Wynn, John Wild, Shea Bradad, Brandon Paletta, Jennifer Wright, Boom Handle, Donald Lee, Lori Lord, Baby QB, David McCluskey, Donald Decker, Dan Miller, Alex Hwang, Arnaldo Espinoza, Dan Guestford, Peter Ritaka, Caleb Cookster, and SoCal Pack. See you guys tomorrow. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.